Now this year, NATO celebrates 75 years of the Transatlantic Alliance, but it's also a significant marker for a new alliance of countries that joined 25 years ago. That included Poland, included the Czech Republic and Hungary. Now, that wasn't by any means a foregone conclusion that this would happen this way. It's very much also a product of human interaction and a human story, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. My guest for that is Bartosz Węglarczyk, who is the editor-in-chief of Onet and a veteran journalist, and he's going to share his story about all of this with me today. Thanks so much, Bartosz, for sitting down with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I mean, editor-in-chief, let's also point out that you are a veteran journalist of many decades experience. I think this is a very personal story with you as well. I mean, we know the headlines, but I think NATO expansion, accession of Poland in particular, you were involved from that, right from the start. So walk us through the beginning first times of that process.
Let me, at the beginning, correct you a little bit. I'm a young journalist with a very long career.
Okay.
So let's call it that way. But to go back to the NATO issue, yeah, there was a very long process that started long before we actually joined NATO. And to tell you the truth, I think it's the most brilliant PR campaign that the Polish government ever run. And I don't think it's never going to happen again. I think it's impossible for Polish government or any other Central European government to run this kind of campaign again. I'm very happy it happened when it happened. I don't think it would be possible again today. So yes, that's a brilliant history that involves a lot of brilliant people, diplomats, politicians, intellectuals, journalists. And artists as well.
Yeah. So let's go back a little bit to the beginning, because I think when you think of NATO, they are already certain members. Now we're also looking at 32 members actually this year. But let's go back to those crucial years, even before 1999. I mean, the upheavals of what were going on here in terms of the end of communism, the fall of the wall, a whole new dynamic, which I think most people didn't even understand what was next. But I think what's key here, Bartosz, right, it wasn't that people opened up NATO for Poland or for Hungary, right? This is something like Poland had to really fight for, right?
Absolutely. Actually, at the beginning of the process, at the beginning of the 90s, I would say that majority of politicians inside NATO member states didn't want NATO to enlarge. And they didn't foresee Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic joining NATO. And we had to fight for majority of votes. We had to move people from opposite side of the discussion. Even in the US, that actually ran the whole NATO, and it's still running, the US is running NATO today, but even inside the US administration and US circles of influence, majority of people couldn't imagine NATO to be enlarged. So a lot of things had to happen. There were a lot of milestones, there were a lot of turning points, starting from beginning of the 90s up to the last moment. Even at the day when the US Senate voted to have Poland inside, Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary into NATO, even then, at the very last moment, we were not sure, up to the last minute, if the US Senate, which was a key vote in the whole process, if the US Senate would actually vote for the NATO enlargement.
And this was back in 1998, I believe. So
this
just
is
shortly.
99. This is 99, the April of 1999.
So really, as you said, the last second,
Absolutely.
Still unclear.
And believe me, the whole process, every single day, all of us that either work for the campaign or cover the campaign, as being a journalist, I did cover it for almost 10 years. Every single day we expected something bad to happen or something good to happen. You had no idea what would happen. And there were all kinds of news all the time from all over the world, from Russia, from Moscow, from Brussels, from Washington, and any other NATO member state.
Mm-hmm. Let's dive into that a little bit as well, because we know that at the very beginning, it was unclear if NATO would expand.
It was clear NATO would not expand.
Yeah.
That's the starting point.
Yeah, and I think it was John Keegan, I think it was a U.S. advisor, who very much said, I think infamously, that this was the worst possible policy decision that could happen.
Well, there are a lot of people in Washington, especially in Washington, who didn't want NATO to enlarge. I think one of the biggest opponents of the process was Strobe Talbot, who was at the peak of his career. He was a deputy secretary of state. And he was very strongly against NATO enlargement. And it was up to the Polish diplomats, especially back then Polish ambassador to the US, Mr. Jerzy Koźmiński, to convince him to support NATO enlargement. And in the end, it happened. But if you ask me, up to 93, 94, majority of people who work for the State Department and majority of people who work for the national security apparatus at the White House were strongly opposing NATO enlargement.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is also going to make people wonder here. I mean, very much I think now if we look at modern NATO, Poland and NATO, I mean, it's an incredibly strong partner. I mean, obviously the security dynamic has changed once again, but I think one of the very few countries that is at the top line, almost 4% of GDP in defense funding. But looking back at those early days, in your sense, was it because Poland needed to prove itself, it needed to convince the Americans, as you said? I mean, this is sort of where this side we don't hear that much about. Was this something that has now reaped dividends for you? You've observed what's going on here in NATO for a long time. Is Poland now at a higher level because of those early days in partnership? Or as you said earlier, is it still only America's game in this?
Well, one of the most important arguments for Poland to join NATO from the Polish perspective was that if Poland wanted to join NATO, we had to become, first of all, a fully democratic country with a fully functioning civil control over military. It didn't work that way before. So for us, moving Poland towards NATO will also meant having free economy, having modern military, having modern military civil control system over military. I can't see even one bad side of NATO enlargement process. And the way that the Polish diplomats explained to the US and other NATO member states was, one, if Poland joins NATO, that means that Poland is ready to join NATO. Mm-hmm. And if Poland is ready to join NATO, it means that you have the whole area of democracy in Central Europe is moving forward. So you have to have us inside NATO because it proves that there is a democracy in Central Europe. If there is a democracy in Central Europe, that means there will be no more wars in Central Europe, which is, good for everybody. So that was basically the simplest argument that we could do for NATO enlargement, and it worked.
Yeah. Now, you wrote extensively about this piece, I think, on NATO's 20th anniversary as well, a few years ago. And in terms of, I think there's a very, some would say infamous or famous dinner, I think, between President Walesa and Boris Yeltsin in Warsaw. So I think we need to talk about this. What happened at that dinner that I think changed a lot in the road of Poland and other countries joining NATO?
Whiskey happened. That's what happened at dinner. But let's start with Lech Wałęsa. Lech Wałęsa, the former Polish president, played a very important role in the NATO enlargement campaign. He was the most famous Pole, apart from the Pope, this John Paul II. He was the second most famous Pole in the world. His opinion mattered. People listened to him, especially in the US. If you ever accompany Lech Wałęsa in the US, Americans love him up to today. They truly love him. Even presidents behave like children when they met him. What happened in '93 was he was back then the president of Poland. Boris Yeltsin, back then the president of Russia, came to Warsaw. And one of the key points of the discussions, apart from Soviet troops getting out of Poland, the other key point of the discussion was NATO enlargement. What Wałęsa wanted from Yeltsin was to have Yeltsin say that there is no danger for Russia from NATO enlargement, and Russia is fine with Poland joining NATO. It was very important because there were a lot of people in the West who said, we cannot enlarge NATO because once we do it, there will be a war with Russia. So Poland wanted to say, don't worry, even Russia doesn't think that there would be a war over Poland joining NATO. So what happened at the dinner was, there was a lot of whiskey, both of men drank a lot, and at a certain point, Wałęsa asked Yeltsin to sign a declaration saying that Russia is fine with NATO enlargement. And Yeltsin said, well, I agree with this, but my advisors don't want me to sign such a document. But then Wałęsa said, well, if I think I want to sign something, I don't listen to my advisors, I just do it. Mm-hmm. And because, as I said, both of the men were in a certain state at the point, Yeltsin said, "You're absolutely right. If I want to sign it, I'm going to do it." And he signed it.
But he later denied that, right? He tried to undermine what he did.
What happened later was he went back to Moscow, and then the Russian generals met him, and he said, "What did you do? You can't do this. Now you have to withdraw your signature." But back then, by that point, the document was already sent to the Western capitals. Everybody read it, so it was too late.
Let's also go back a little bit, because in 1991, I think, was a very, very critical meeting in Brussels at NATO HQ, actually, with very much unclear situation. All these countries that later would join, former Warsaw Pact nations, the Soviet Union / Russia also included in there. And within those early days, and I want to get your opinion on this, because then it was sort of reiterated again in a certain way in 2000. At that point, Yeltsin made some kind of move towards saying Russia should join, or would like to somehow join NATO. We have an interview, I think it was done by the BBC on 2000, with acting President Putin, who was given that same question: was Russia prepared to join NATO? And I think he said along the lines of, well, if we're equal partners, why not? If Russia's respected, why not? Now, you could easily just look at this and say, oh, there was clear interest by Russia. For you, in your experience, was this actually sincere at any time from Russia, or is this just another Russian tactic and ploy to sow division?
I think there's a big difference between Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin. I strongly believe that Yeltsin never wanted to go to war with anybody. He was actually pushed to war by his generals with Chechnya, for example, but he himself didn't want to do any other war. Why? Because he was from the generation that still remembered World War II. Putin doesn't remember it anymore. And so anything that came from Putin after 2000, we now know he was not sincere, and he lied all the time. And he lied to everyone about everything, basically. Yeltsin was a different guy. I actually talked to Yeltsin. I met him several times, and I liked him. I truly liked him. You have to remember, he was the first and the only leader of either Soviet Union or Russia that admitted Katyn massacre. He actually took responsibility for Russians killing Poles in Katyn. And I think a lot of people in Poland still remember it. Putin, it's easy to talk after the war started in Ukraine. Now we know that we should expect everything from him, everything bad. Back then, nobody could be sure about anything. The difference, I think, was that back in the 90s, all of the Central European countries, especially Baltic states, and Poland and Czech Republic, told everyone in Western Europe, you cannot trust Russia. You always have to be ready for something bad to happen in Russia. Nobody believed us. And actually, that was one of the things that we had to fight against during the NATO enlargement process. There were voices, especially in the US, especially in the US Senate, that said that Poland wants to join NATO for one reason only: to push NATO into the war with Russia, which was ridiculous. And that was basically not true, but that's what people said, and they said it because we always said, don't trust Russians, always expect something bad to happen. And it did, as we know.
As we've unfortunately seen. Also an observation, because we know that Poland is playing a key role right now, and always has. It's modernized its military to, I think, one of the most modern in this entire region, up to that NATO standard. But at the same time, let's look at the other allies that have joined. In that first step, when we mark that accession in 1999, you have Hungary, for instance. You also had the Czech Republic. From your observations, that appetite, obviously, if you look at Havel, who was actually rebuffed back in the early 90s, yes. They wouldn't even sign a joint declaration with them, NATO ambassadors. Yes. That changed. We're now looking at new members. But was the attitude from Hungary, from the Czech Republic, was that the same? Let's say, how did that change? Because obviously Hungarian policy right now is very different, and if we wouldn't know, it's not quite the best and ideal ally. How have you seen that change? Was that only because of Orban? Was that something else that already happened before? What was Hungary's attitude to all this from the beginning?
I think Viktor Orban changed. I think he was a different person back then. And you have to remember, that was the guy that allowed George Soros to pay for his studies in Western Europe. And then suddenly, today, George Soros is one of the main enemies of the Hungarian government. It doesn't make any sense. So I think Orban at certain point decided that he wants to change his image, that he wants to be an anti-European politician. The Visegrad group is basically non-existent anymore. It's basically dissolved, even if not officially, unofficially, it doesn't exist anymore. Hungary is in a completely different spot. It's a different story with Czech Republic because Václav Havel, the first president of Czech Republic, he was a very pro-European politician, and he was very strongly pro-NATO. So he was a very, very good ally of Poland in the NATO enlargement process. But then after him, different people came in, and the previous Czech president was actually much more pro-Russian than even Viktor Orban is today. Right now, we have a different story because the new Czech government and the new Czech president are very pro-European and very pro-NATO. And Czech Republic is very strongly in support of Ukraine, for example, right now. Hungary is basically gone. Hungary is no more a good NATO ally. And it's actually no more a good European Union ally of Poland.
Yeah. But I also want to go back to this incredible story, as we alluded at the beginning, that it was not just very much a PR victory for Poland and the Polish government, but it required several levels and interest groups, and that goes down to very much also the Polish diaspora in the United States. And I think there's a really interesting story. Tell us briefly about that, because it wasn't so clear that these senators in the U.S. would sign this accession document, that they would agree to expansion. So tell us the role there. I think it's also interesting to mention there Joe Biden, who was a senator at that time.
Yes. So the campaign to get the support of the U.S. Senate, because that's what it came down to, was to get the support of the White House and then to get the support of the U.S. Senate. You have to remember the politics in the U.S. is different from the European politics. The White House doesn't control the U.S. Senate. It doesn't mean that the U.S. president tells the U.S. senators what to do. You have to convince them to vote for something. There is an old saying that says that the U.S. Senate is composed of 100 presidents, because every U.S. senator thinks they should be a president one day. So what happened was at the beginning, in the middle of the 90s, when we knew that there is a chance for us to join NATO, the Polish diplomacy made a list of U.S. senators, and they knew they don't have enough votes. So the Polish ambassador to the U.S., Mr. Jerzy Koźmiński, created a list of things they have to do. And he came with an idea of 5 circles of the sources of influence in the U.S. And he said, if we get majority of people inside those 5 circles, we'll get the U.S. Senate to vote for us. One of the first circle was the White House. The last circle were the social organizations in the U.S., the trade unions, Jewish organizations, and so on and so on. And he created this huge network of people involving diplomats, artists, politicians, Polish Americans, Polish Jewish activists, that they were pushing towards getting support from Poland joining NATO. It was a very complicated campaign. It involved political steps, but it also involved a Polish soccer team that challenged the U.S. Department of Defense to play soccer with us. And even there was a big debate in the Polish embassy. And the first idea was, let's play baseball with them, because that's a very American sport. And then someone came with the idea of playing soccer, because Americans do not like to play soccer, and they actually don't know how to play soccer. So let's play soccer, because then we win, and then we can probably get more out of them if we win. And they created a soccer team. The soccer team was run by Mr. Mariusz Hanzlik, who was a diplomat at the Polish embassy to the US. He actually died in Smolensk in 2010. And they gathered, and by playing soccer with the young staffers of the defense, the Department of Defense, of the Pentagon, they gathered their support, and they got them to push their bosses to support Poland into NATO. There's even a saying that, thanks to the campaign, a kind of a Polish mafia was created in Washington. By Polish mafia, I mean a group of Americans who liked Poland, who understood the Polish point of view, and who supported us. And I have to say that, with years on, we got more and more high officials into the so-called Polish mafia, up to Mr. Strobe Talbot, who at a certain point changed his opinion and he started to support Poland joining NATO.
Right. So as you said, but I think the main takeaway from that is it involved really a whole effort from politics down to individuals, down to the football pitch.
It involved everyone, truly everyone. Every Polish government in the 90s supported NATO enlargement. And they did everything they could. Even if it was left-wing government or right-wing government, all of them supported NATO enlargement. You had Andrzej Wajda, famous Polish director. Every time he went to the US and someone asked him about his movies, he said, let's not talk about movies, let's talk about NATO enlargement and why Poland should join NATO. Every time anybody from Western Europe was coming to Poland with an official visit, the only questions they got at the press conference were, will you support Poland joining NATO? When will it happen? How will you do it? The Polish-American organizations that sent thousands and thousands of letters to everyone, the congressmen, senators, State Department, the White House, asking, when will you get Poland into NATO? And it worked, but it was amazing, amazing effort. I never seen anything like this in the past, and I've never seen anything like this since then.
Right, but I think we'll conclude on that and just see how incredibly important that was to the heart of Poles, the diaspora community, and I think the involvement at all levels. And I hope that's also something why NATO is so incredibly important to Poland in this region and Europe. And let's hope that others can learn from it.
And let's hope others can join. I'm very happy that we're talking at the moment when Sweden is joining NATO. I'm very happy about Finland joining NATO, and I hope others. And to tell you the truth, I hope one day Russia will join NATO. Because if Russia joins NATO, it's the same thinking that there was with Poland. If Russia joins NATO, that means that Russia is a democratic country, is a free country with a free market and democracy.
All right, so one step at a time, but thank you, Bartosz, for all that.
Thank
really
you so
appreciate
much.
all this.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That's Sasha Farbach for TVP World. Goodbye.